In a sun-drenched suburban home in California, Margaret Chen sits in handcuffs, staring at the family photos that line her living room walls. At 80 years old, she never imagined she'd be arrested in the home she's lived in for 5 decades. The same home where she raised 3 children and cared for 2 stepchildren after their mother's passing. But today, the perfectly manicured lawn and pristine garden she tends to daily have become the stage for her stepdaughter's most vindictive performance yet. As the police escort her past the neighbors' stunned faces, Margaret catches a glimpse of her stepdaughter, Victoria's triumphant smile. After 30 years of failed attempts to drive a wedge between Margaret and her father, Victoria has finally found the perfect weapon, a web of carefully crafted lies that could send an innocent grandmother to prison. What Victoria doesn't realize is that she's not dealing with just another fragile elderly woman. Margaret spent decades as a paralegal before retirement, and she knows better than anyone that the truth leaves a trail if you know where to look. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The halls of Anderson and Mitchell Law had always been Margaret's second home. For 25 years, she'd walked the polished marble floors as the firm's most trusted paralegal, her heels clicking against the stone in a rhythm that matched the beating heart of justice. It was there, amid towering shelves of legal volumes and the gentle hum of fluorescent lights, that she first met James Chen. He wasn't like the other clients who walked through their doors. While most came seeking vindication or revenge, James simply wanted to ensure his children's future after losing his wife to cancer. His quiet dignity and gentle manner with the office staff caught Margaret's attention immediately. She remembered how his hands trembled slightly as he arranged his late wife's papers on her desk, the wedding ring still firmly in place. Their love story began slowly, built on shared lunches discussing his case and casual conversations about their children. Margaret, a widow herself, understood the weight of raising children alone. Her 3 teenagers, Michael, Sarah, and David, were her world, just as Victoria and Thomas were James's. When James finally asked her to dinner, 6 months after his case closed, Margaret's answer came with both hope and hesitation. The first family dinner was a disaster. Victoria, then 15, refused to eat the meal Margaret had spent hours preparing. Thomas, 12, at least tried the dumplings before retreating to his room. Margaret's own children, closer to adulthood, made awkward attempts at conversation that fell flat in the heavy silence. But James's steady presence and unwavering smile told her they would find their way. Margaret approached blending their families like she did her legal work, with patience, attention to detail, and absolute dedication. She learned each child's favorite foods, their fears, their dreams. She attended every school event, every sports game, every recital. When Sarah struggled with calculus, Margaret hired the best tutor. When Thomas showed interest in photography, she helped him set up a darkroom in the basement. Victoria, though, remained a fortress. The young girl's resistance took many forms over the years. She'd forget to tell Margaret about parent-teacher. Conferences deliberately exclude her from conversations about college plans and make pointed references to her real mom at family gatherings. Each slight was a paper cut to Margaret's heart, but she never stopped trying. She kept Victoria's favorite snacks in the pantry, remembered every birthday with thoughtful gifts, and defended her to James when teenage rebellion pushed boundaries too far. The day James legally adopted Margaret's children was meant to be a celebration of their united family. Margaret had spent weeks planning a special dinner, carefully selecting dishes that represented both their cultures. Michael, Sarah, and David were touched by James's decision, understanding its significance at 21, 19, and 18. But Victoria's words at the dinner table cut through the joy like a knife. Just because you've trapped Dad into playing daddy to your kids doesn't make us family. Yet Margaret persisted. When Victoria called at 3 a.m. needing a ride home from a party, Margaret went without question. When she crashed her first car, Margaret helped her find a job to pay for repairs. Through college applications, graduation, first job interviews, and even Victoria's own wedding, Margaret remained a steady, supportive presence. She attended every holiday dinner with homemade dishes and thoughtful gifts, even as Victoria's cold shoulder never thawed. James would sometimes apologize for his daughter's behavior, his eyes heavy with the weight of divided loyalties. But Margaret would simply squeeze his hand and remind him that love wasn't about keeping score. She'd learned long ago that family wasn't built in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments of showing up day after day, year after year. Looking back, now as the police car pulls away from her beloved home, Margaret realizes she never saw the depth of Victoria's hatred. All those years of reaching out, of trying to build bridges, had only given her stepdaughter more ammunition. Every family photo on those walls tells a story of love and perseverance, but Victoria had been writing a different narrative all along, one that would try to erase 30 years of dedication in a single day. For the outside world, the Chen family embodied the American dream. Their Christmas cards showed a smiling, multicultural family that seemed to defy the odds of blended household statistics. But beneath the polished surface, Victoria's resentment festered like a wound that refused to heal. Growing more potent with each passing year, it began to show more clearly after Victoria's own marriage failed. While the rest of the family rallied around her during the divorce, she seemed to blame Margaret for her father's sympathetic words about learning from Margaret's strength after losing her first husband. The comment, meant to inspire hope, only fueled Victoria's conviction that Margaret had somehow orchestrated her entire life to steal her father's affection. The family dynamics shifted dramatically when James's health began to decline. The diagnosis came on a sunny Tuesday morning: aggressive pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Margaret's world tilted on its axis, but she held herself together, knowing she needed to be strong for everyone, especially James. The next 6 months became a blur of hospital visits, medication schedules, and quiet nights holding her husband's increasingly frail hand. Victoria suddenly became a constant presence in their home, arriving unannounced at all hours. On the surface, her attention appeared daughterly, but Margaret noticed how Victoria would whisper to James when she thought no one was listening, how documents would mysteriously appear for James to sign during his more lucid moments, how his medical files would be slightly out of order after Victoria's visits. The tension reached a breaking point one evening when Margaret overheard Victoria on the phone in the garden. "Once Dad's gone, we'll finally get what's ours," she was saying. "That woman won't know what hit her." Margaret's hand trembled as she watered her roses, pretending she hadn't heard, but her paralegal instincts kicked in. That night, she began documenting everything, every visit, every whispered conversation, every moved paper. James passed away on a quiet Sunday morning, with Margaret holding one hand and Victoria the other. In his final moments, he squeezed Margaret's hand and whispered, "Take care of them all." Victoria's eyes narrowed at the exchange, but she maintained her grieving daughter facade as relatives and friends filled the house with condolences and casseroles. The reading of the will took place 2 weeks later in the same law office where Margaret and James had first met. Victoria sat straight-backed in her designer suit, a picture of confident expectation. The family gathered in the conference room, all 5 children, their spouses, and Margaret. James's old friend and lawyer, Howard Martinez, cleared his throat. Before beginning, as Howard read through the document, Victoria's expression shifted from confidence to disbelief to barely contained rage. James had divided everything equally among all 6 of them, Margaret and the 5 children, each receiving an equal share of his estate. The family home would remain Margaret's, as they had owned it jointly. Victoria's voice cut through the silence that followed. "This can't be right. Daddy would never," but it was right. James had updated his will just 3 months before his diagnosis, making sure every detail was legally sound. He'd even videotaped his statement of intent, explaining his wish to treat all his children, step and biological, equally, and to ensure his beloved wife would be secure. Victoria stormed out of the office, her heels stabbing the same marble floors where her father and Margaret's love story had begun. The next few weeks brought a parade of lawyers to Victoria's door, each one confirming the will's validity. Margaret watched her stepdaughter's desperation grow, manifesting in increasingly erratic behavior. Victoria began spreading rumors among family friends, suggesting Margaret had manipulated James in his final months. She started showing up at the homes of her siblings, both step and biological, trying to convince them that Margaret had somehow engineered the entire situation. Most of the family saw through Victoria's accusations, but her brother Thomas wavered, caught between loyalty to his blood sister and the stepmother who had lovingly raised him. This divided loyalty would later prove crucial in Victoria's plan to destroy Margaret's life. Looking at the family photos on the wall now, as she sits in the precinct waiting room, Margaret can trace the progression of Victoria's scheme in the family gatherings that followed James's death. Each forced smile, each calculated move, each seemingly innocent question about Margaret's handling of James's final affairs, all of it had been building to this moment. Victoria had spent months weaving her web of deception, and now Margaret was caught in its threads. What Victoria hadn't counted on was that Margaret had spent decades untangling far more complex legal webs. Even now, as she faces the most serious accusations of her life, Margaret's mind is already cataloguing every detail, every document, every conversation that could expose the truth. Because while Victoria had learned to manipulate, Margaret had learned something far more powerful. She had learned how to fight for justice within the system that Victoria was now trying to use against her. The accusations came like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of lies. It began with a visit from Detective Sarah Martinez on a Wednesday morning, her badge glinting in the morning sun as she stood on Margaret's doorstep. The detective's face carried the uncomfortable expression of someone tasked with questioning a grandmother about a serious crime. "Mrs. Chen, we've received some concerning documents regarding your husband's estate," Detective Martinez began, her notepad already open. "Would you mind explaining these bank transfers from Mr. Chen's accounts in the months before his death?" Margaret's hands shook as she examined the papers the detective placed before her. They looked authentic. Bank statements showing large transfers to offshore accounts, documents bearing what appeared to be James's signature, power of attorney papers she'd never seen before. Her paralegal training kicked in as her eyes caught subtle inconsistencies, dates that didn't align with James's hospital stays, signatures that seemed slightly off, bank accounts she'd never known about. "These aren't real," Margaret said firmly, her voice steadier than her hands. "I've never seen these documents before, and I handled all of James's paperwork during his illness." But Victoria had done her homework. She'd spent months building her case, creating a paper trail that painted Margaret as a calculating predator who had married James for his money and spent years positioning herself to steal his fortune. The evidence suggested that Margaret had taken advantage of James's deteriorating condition to drain his accounts, allegedly hiding millions in overseas banks. The investigation snowballed quickly. Victoria had filed a detailed complaint, complete with witness statements from James's old business associates who remembered conversations where James had expressed concerns about Margaret's access to his accounts. She'd even produced emails, later proved to be expertly fabricated, showing Margaret allegedly discussing the transfer of funds with overseas contacts. What made the accusations particularly convincing was how Victoria had woven truth into her lies. She used real events, Margaret's regular visits to the bank during James's illness, her management of his medical bills, her role in updating his will, and twisted them into something sinister. Each legitimate action was reframed as part of an elaborate scheme to defraud a dying man. The most damaging evidence came in the form of a video recording. Victoria had somehow obtained footage of Margaret in James's hospital room, shot through the window, showing her helping James sign documents. The video, stripped of its context, made it appear as though Margaret was forcing James's hand. Sans reality, she had been helping him sign authorization forms for his medical treatment, but Victoria's narrative transformed this act of care into something criminal. Thomas, Victoria's brother, had provided a statement that proved particularly damaging. His testimony was careful, seeming reluctant, which made it all the more believable. He spoke of unusual patterns he'd noticed, conversations he'd overheard, and concerns he'd been too afraid to voice. His statement painted a picture of Margaret as someone who had maintained a perfect facade while systematically taking advantage of their father. The police investigation revealed Victoria's masterful manipulation of the timeline. She'd chosen to strike now, months after James's death, when grief had begun to soften into routine, and Margaret had settled into her new normal. The timing made Margaret appear as though she'd been waiting for the dust to settle before accessing her supposedly hidden accounts. Detective Martinez's questions became increasingly pointed as the morning wore on. Can you explain these signatures? Where were you on these dates? Do you have documentation of how Mr. Chen's medical care was paid for? Each question revealed another layer of Victoria's elaborate trap. Margaret's responses were clear and confident, born from years of legal experience, but she could see the doubt in the detective's eyes. The evidence, though fabricated, was overwhelming. Victoria had created a narrative so compelling that even Margaret's steady denials seemed to reinforce the image of a calculating criminal. The final blow came when Detective Martinez revealed statements from Margaret's own bank, showing large deposits that coincided with withdrawals from James's accounts. These transactions, Margaret realized with horror, were the legitimate transfers James had made to their joint account for his medical expenses. But Victoria had somehow obtained records that made these routine transactions appear suspicious. As the handcuffs closed around her wrists, Margaret thought of James and his final words, "Take care of them all." She hadn't understood then that taking care of them might mean fighting to protect his legacy from the very people he'd trusted her to watch over. Detective Martinez read Margaret her rights in a voice that carried a note of genuine regret. As she was led to the police car, Margaret caught sight of Victoria watching from her parked car across the street. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Margaret saw something she'd never seen before in her stepdaughter's gaze. Not just triumph, but a deep, desperate fear. It was the look of someone who had wagered everything on a dangerous gamble. That glimpse of fear became Margaret's first ray of hope. Because in all her years as a paralegal, she'd learned one crucial truth. People who act from fear make mistakes. And Victoria, for all her careful planning, was clearly terrified of something that might just prove to be the key to unraveling her entire scheme. The holding cell at the county jail smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. Margaret sat on the hard metal bench, her perfectly pressed gardening clothes now wrinkled from hours of processing. Her fingerprints had been taken, her belongings catalogued, her dignity stripped away layer by layer. At 80 years old, she found herself in a place she'd only seen from the other side of the justice system. The processing officer, a woman named Garcia, had been surprisingly gentle. Perhaps it was Margaret's age, or maybe the disconnect between her appearance, a petite, elegant grandmother, and the charges against her. Officer Garcia had even found her a sweater when she noticed Margaret shivering in the cold cell. "Mrs. Chen," a voice called from beyond the bars. A tired-looking man in his 50s stood there, clutching a worn leather briefcase. "I'm Paul Davidson, your court-appointed attorney." His eyes held a mix of concern and resignation, the look of someone who'd seen too many cases like hers, or at least thought he had. The interview room was barely bigger than a closet, but Margaret, sat straight-backed in her chair, just as she had during thousands of client meetings in her paralegal days. As Davidson began explaining her situation, she interrupted him with a quiet but firm voice. "Mr. Davidson, before we continue, I need you to understand something. I spent 25 years as a paralegal at Anderson and Mitchell. I know exactly what financial elder abuse charges entail, and I know exactly what evidence would be needed to prove them. What I need from you is not an explanation of my charges, but a partner in proving that every document Victoria provided is fraudulent." Davidson's demeanor shifted slightly, his posture straightening as he reassessed his client. "Tell me everything," he said, pulling out a legal pad. For the next 2 hours, Margaret methodically laid out her history with Victoria, James's illness, and every detail she could remember about the documents Detective Martinez had shown her. As she spoke, Margaret's mind was already cataloguing potential evidence. She had copies of all James's legitimate medical authorizations, backed up both digitally and in hard copy. She had recordings of their meetings with doctors. James had insisted on recording everything to help him remember details through his pain medication haze. Most importantly, she had her own meticulous records of every financial transaction made during James's illness. A commotion in the hallway interrupted their meeting. Through the small window in the door, Margaret caught sight of her children, Michael, Sarah, and David, arguing with officers about visiting hours. The sight of them brought her first tears of the day. She hadn't called them. They must have heard about her arrest from someone else. "Mrs. Chen," Davidson said, drawing her attention back, "these bank statements Victoria provided, showing transfers to offshore accounts. You're certain you've never seen them before?" "Mr. Davidson, I handled every aspect of James's finances. During his illness, we had joint accounts at 3 banks, all local. James never had offshore accounts, and he certainly wasn't making transfers while on his deathbed." She paused, a memory surfacing. But Victoria had been asking about international banking regulations a few months ago. She said it was for a client. Davidson's eyebrows rose. "Victoria works in finance." "No," Margaret replied, her mind racing. "She's a real estate agent. She's never handled international transactions." The significance of this detail hung in the air between them. As night fell, Margaret was returned to her cell. The concrete walls seemed to close in as she lay on the thin mattress, but her mind was clearer than it had been all day. Victoria's careful scheme had one fundamental flaw. She didn't understand the legal system as well as she thought she did. She had created evidence that looked convincing at first glance, but wouldn't stand up to serious scrutiny. Through the small window in her cell, Margaret could see a sliver of the night sky. She remembered nights spent stargazing with James, his quiet voice explaining constellations to their children. "The truth is like the North Star," he used to say. "No matter how lost you feel, it will guide you home." Just before midnight, Officer Garcia appeared with an unexpected delivery. A stack of papers from Davidson. "Your lawyer said you'd want to review these tonight," she said with a small smile. "He also said to tell you he's contacted someone named Linda Matthews at Anderson and Mitchell." Margaret's heart leaped. Linda had been her protégée at the firm, now a senior paralegal herself. If Linda was getting involved, Victoria's perfectly constructed house of cards might start tumbling sooner than expected. As she began reviewing the documents in the harsh fluorescent light, Margaret noticed something she'd missed earlier. The bank statements Victoria had produced all came from the same bank, First National Trust. But James had closed his account there 5 years ago after a dispute over service charges. It was a small detail, one that most people wouldn't think to check, but it was exactly the kind of mistake that could unravel an entire fraud. Margaret allowed herself a small smile as she made notes in the margins of her papers. Victoria had spent months building her trap, but she'd made the classic mistake of many fraudsters. She'd been too thorough, too perfect in her forgeries. Real life left traces, inconsistencies, small human errors that her stepdaughter's manufactured evidence lacked. In the darkness of her cell, Margaret began planning her defense. She might be behind bars, but her mind was free to work, and she had decades of legal experience to draw upon. Victoria thought she was destroying her stepmother's life, but she had actually given Margaret something unexpected, a chance to finally expose the truth about who her stepdaughter really was. Linda Matthews strode into the jail's visiting room like she was walking into a courtroom, her steel-grey hair pulled back in a pristine bun, her briefcase bulging with documents. When she saw Margaret in the orange jumpsuit, her professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing the anger underneath. "I've spent the last 12 hours going through every file we have on James's case," Linda said without preamble. "Something's very wrong here, Margaret. The signatures on those new documents. They're good forgeries, but they don't match James's writing pattern from his last years. The tremor from his medication isn't there." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for her former colleague's sharp eye. Victoria didn't know about the tremor. She was never there for his medical appointments, never saw how the medication affected him. A knock at the door interrupted them. Detective Martinez entered, followed by a younger detective Margaret hadn't met before. "Mrs. Chen," Martinez said, her tone carefully neutral, "this is Detective Jason Wong. He's been reviewing your case and has some questions about the bank documents." Detective Wong pulled out a chair, his young face serious, but his eyes kind. "Mrs. Chen, I noticed something interesting about the transfer dates. Several of them coincide with days Mr. Chen was in surgery, according to his medical records. Records show he was under anesthesia when he supposedly authorized these transfers." "That's impossible," Margaret and Linda said simultaneously. They shared a knowing look. This was exactly the kind of detail that could crack the case wide open. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Thomas, Victoria's brother, arrived at the police station later that day. His face was drawn with conflict as he requested to speak with the detectives. Through the interview room window, Margaret watched her stepson fidget with his wedding ring, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. "I need to amend my statement," Thomas began hesitantly. I wasn't entirely truthful before. Victoria asked me to corroborate her story. She said it was the only way to restore our family's honor. But something doesn't feel right. Dad trusted Margaret. He always said she was the best decision he ever made. Margaret's children had been working tirelessly as well. Michael, her eldest, had taken leave from his software engineering job to help Detective Wong analyze the digital trail of the forged documents. Sarah, a social worker, had compiled statements from James's medical team about Margaret's dedicated care during his illness. David, the youngest and a journalism major, had begun investigating Victoria's recent financial activities. "Mom," David said during his visit, his reporter's notebook in hand, "I found something interesting. Victoria's real estate license was suspended 3 months ago. She's been hiding it from everyone, but she's deep in debt. She's been living off credit cards and payday loans." The pieces were starting to come together, but Victoria had one more card to play. She appeared at the jail, demanding to speak with Margaret. Against her lawyer's advice, Margaret agreed to the meeting. She wanted to look her stepdaughter in the eye. Victoria swept into the room in designer clothes that couldn't quite hide her desperation. "Drop the investigation," she hissed, "or I'll make sure every newspaper in the state runs your story. Your reputation will be ruined, even if you prove your innocence." Margaret studied the woman before her, this child she had tried so hard to love for 30 years. "Victoria," she said softly, "what happened to the little girl who used to help? Me garden, the one who knew the name of every rose in our backyard?" For a moment, Victoria's mask slipped, revealing a flash of the hurt, angry teenager she'd never quite grown beyond. But then her walls slammed back into place. "That little girl watched you steal her father's love," she spat. "And now I'm taking back what's mine." As Victoria stormed out, Officer Garcia appeared with a surprising piece of news. "Mrs. Chen, "There's someone else here to see you. Says his name is Robert Martinez, Howard Martinez's son. He's a forensic accountant." Robert turned out to be exactly what their case needed. As Howard's son, he had access to his father's records from James's original will preparation. "Dad never trusted electronic copies for sensitive documents," Robert explained. "He kept everything in hard copy, including all the preliminary meetings and drafts of Mr. Chen's will. Victoria didn't know about these records when she created her forgeries. The support team grew organically, each person bringing their own expertise to the task of unraveling Victoria's deception. Even some of Margaret's former clients from Anderson and Mitchell had come forward, offering testimonials about her character and integrity. But perhaps the most unexpected ally emerged in the form of Victoria's ex-husband, Mark. He contacted Detective Wong with information about Victoria's gambling debts and her connections to a document forger who specialized in financial papers. "I should have come forward sooner," he admitted. "But Victoria, she has a way of making you doubt everything you know to be true." As Margaret lay in her cell that night, she reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought all these people together. Victoria had tried to isolate her, to paint her as a calculating criminal. Instead, she had inadvertently created a network of supporters determined to uncover the truth. Linda's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "Sometimes, the most devastating attacks bring out our strongest defenders." Margaret smiled in the darkness, thinking of all the people working to clear her name. Victoria had spent years building walls between herself and the family, but in trying to destroy her stepmother, she had only succeeded in bringing everyone else closer together. Robert Martinez spread dozens of financial documents across the prison's interview room table, creating a mosaic of Victoria's desperate financial situation. Bank statements, credit card bills, loan applications, and gambling receipts told a story of mounting debt and increasing desperation. "It started about 2 years ago," Robert explained, pointing to a series of casino charge slips. "Small bets at first, but they grew larger over time. By the time your husband fell ill, Victoria was losing an average of $20,000 a month." Linda Matthews, who had been examining Victoria's loan applications, looked up with a frown. She was taking out loans under her real estate company's name. When the market dropped last year, she couldn't cover them anymore. That's why her license was suspended. Detective Wong added another layer to the financial puzzle, pulling out a thick folder. "We subpoenaed her bank records. She's been moving money between accounts to hide her losses, but the pattern is clear. She needed a big payoff to cover nearly $2 million in gambling debts." Margaret stared at the evidence of her stepdaughter's spiral into addiction and fraud. The inheritance wouldn't have been enough to cover all this, she realized. She needed more than just her share. "That's where this gets interesting," Michael said, joining them with his laptop. He'd been analyzing the metadata from Victoria's forged documents. The files were created using software registered to someone named Marcus Wong. "Ring any bells?" Detective Wong's head snapped up. "Marcus Wong? He's been on our radar for years, suspected of helping the Golden Palace Casino launder money through real estate transactions." Sarah, who had been quietly taking notes, suddenly spoke up. "Mom, remember those open houses Victoria started holding at Dad's old properties? The ones she insisted on handling personally?" The pieces clicked into place. Victoria hadn't just been after the inheritance. She'd been planning to sell off all of James's commercial properties to cover her debts and possibly help launder money for her gambling connections. David burst into the room, waving a printout. "You need to see this. I found Victoria's connection to Marcus Wong. They've been partners in a shell company for the past year. The company's been buying up distressed properties around town." Linda examined the company documents, her experienced eyes catching crucial details. "These properties are all being bought for well below market value and sold at inflated prices days later. Classic money laundering scheme." Margaret remembered something from her final days with James. The night before he died, Victoria was insisting he sign some property transfer papers. She said it was just updating the business records, but he was too tired to read them. I stopped her, said we'd handle it after he'd rested. She paused, the memory bringing fresh pain. He never woke up. Robert was already digging through his father's records. Here it is, the original property deed for the Chen family plaza. Victoria tried to file a transfer of ownership last month, but it was rejected because the signatures didn't match the ones on file. Detective Martinez, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. This explains why Victoria moved against you now, Mrs. Chen. The casino's enforcers must be pressuring her to pay up. She needed control of all the family assets immediately. The team worked through the night, piecing together Victoria's complex web of deception. They discovered she had created elaborate false documents showing Margaret systematically draining James's accounts, while in reality, Victoria had been the one secretly borrowing against family properties to fund her gambling. Michael found evidence that Victoria had hacked into her father's email account after his death, using it to create a fake trail of correspondence that supported her accusations against Margaret. But she'd made a crucial mistake. The emails were dated after the hospital had confiscated James's phone as part of their terminal care protocol. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Thomas had been searching through his old phone backups and found text messages from Victoria discussing her plan. "Need the bitch gone," she'd written 6 months earlier. "Once she's in jail, everything goes to us. Marcus says he can move the properties fast." Linda organized all the evidence into clear, chronological files. "Victoria's desperate," she concluded. "She's not just trying to frame you, Margaret. She's trying to cover up her own crimes before they come to light." As Officer Garcia collected the documents for safekeeping, she paused at the door. "Mrs. Chen, Detective Wong asked me to tell you they're bringing Victoria in for questioning tomorrow morning. They found some interesting documents in Marcus Wong's office." Margaret sat back in her chair, emotionally drained but hopeful. The paper trail Victoria had created to destroy her was nothing compared to the real evidence of her stepdaughter's crimes. Each document, each transaction, each desperate attempt to cover her tracks had only led them closer to the truth. That night, in her cell, Margaret thought about James's favorite saying about truth being like the North Star. Victoria had lost her way in a maze of lies and addiction, but the truth had indeed shown them the path home. Tomorrow, the police would confront Victoria with the evidence, and Margaret's nightmare would begin to end. But as she drifted off to sleep, she felt no triumph, only sadness for the stepdaughter who had destroyed herself trying to destroy her. The Chen family had weathered many storms over their 30 years together, but none quite like this. As news of Victoria's gambling addiction and criminal connections spread through their circle, battle lines were drawn in unexpected ways. Thomas paced the police station lobby, his loyalty torn between his sister and the truth. "I should have seen it," he kept saying to anyone who would listen. All those times she asked to borrow money, the way she'd disappear for days during Dad's illness. "I thought she was just grieving differently." His wife, Jenny, stood by Margaret. "From the start, I've watched that woman love this family for 20 years, she declared during a heated family meeting. While Victoria was missing holidays and birthdays, Margaret was there for every scraped knee, every graduation, every heartbreak. The extended family fractured along fault lines that had existed for years. James's elderly sister, Aunt May, led the faction supporting Victoria. "Blood is blood," she insisted, even when shown evidence of Victoria's crimes. "Margaret was always an outsider looking to steal our family's fortune, but Victoria's own cousins turned against her. They'd witnessed too many years of her manipulation, seen how she'd tried to poison family gatherings with subtle digs and orchestrated dramas. Remember Lucy's wedding?" Victoria's cousin Alice reminded the family how Victoria told everyone. Margaret had deliberately excluded her from the planning, when really she'd skipped every meeting to go gambling. Sarah organized daily vigils outside the jail, gathering supporters who'd known Margaret through her years of community service. Former clients from Anderson and Mitchell shared stories of her integrity. Parents from the children's schools remembered her volunteer work. Even Victoria's ex-husband Mark joined them, bringing photos of Margaret caring for Victoria after her difficult divorce. The most surprising shift came from James's old business partners. They'd initially been cautious, worried about the accusations of financial impropriety. But when they learned of Victoria's connections to Marcus Wong, they rushed to provide evidence of her attempts to manipulate company records. "She came to me 6 months ago," Howard Chen, no relation, James's oldest friend and business partner, told Detective Wong. "Wanted me to backdate some property transfers. Said it was to help Margaret avoid taxes. I refused. Now I understand what she was really planning." Margaret's children formed a protective circle around her. Michael took indefinite leave from his job, setting up a command center in his apartment to coordinate the legal defense. Sarah used her social work connections to gather character witnesses. David's investigative skills proved invaluable as he dug deeper into Victoria's past. But it was Thomas who faced the hardest choice. Victoria called him daily, alternating between threats and tearful pleas for help. "You're my brother," she would cry. "We shared a womb. How can you choose her over me?" The breaking point came during a supervised jail visit between the siblings. Thomas had finally gathered the courage to confront his sister directly. Margaret, watching through the observation window with Detective Martinez, saw the moment Victoria's mask cracked completely. "You want the truth?" Victoria screamed, all pretense of innocence gone. "Fine. I took the money. I forged the documents. That bitch took everything from us the day she married Dad, and I had to make it right." Thomas stood up slowly, his face pale. "No, Victoria. The only thing Margaret took was the burden of raising 2 ungrateful stepchildren who never gave her a chance." He walked out without looking back, leaving his sister sobbing in the visitation room. The revelation of Victoria's crimes forced every family member to re-examine their own memories, their own prejudices. Aunt May still couldn't fully let go of her belief in blood ties, but she stopped actively campaigning against Margaret. Cousins, who had stayed neutral for years, finally spoke up about Victoria's pattern of manipulation. Even some of Victoria's staunchest supporters began to waver when evidence of her gambling addiction came to light. Her childhood friend Grace finally came forward with security footage from her restaurant, showing Victoria meeting with Marcus Wong late at night, passing documents in shadowy corners. The family's younger generation proved more adaptable. Thomas's teenage daughters, who had grown up knowing Margaret only as their loving grandmother, started a social media campaign to share positive stories about her. Their hashtag, #DuJustice, for Grandma Margaret, went viral in their community, drawing attention to the broader issue of elder abuse accusations being used as weapons in family disputes. Margaret watched these developments from her cell with mixed emotions. Each show of support warmed her heart, but the depth of Victoria's hatred still cut deep. She thought of all the bedtime stories she'd read to Victoria, all the teenage dramas she'd patiently navigated, all the adult crises she'd helped manage. Somewhere along the way, her stepdaughter had twisted every act of love into evidence of manipulation. Late one night, Officer Garcia brought Margaret a letter from Thomas. Inside was a faded photograph she'd never seen before. Victoria as a little girl, fast asleep on Margaret's lap during a family picnic. On the back, in James's handwriting, "My 2 girls finally at peace. If only it could last." Margaret traced the image with her finger, remembering that day. Victoria had fought taking a nap until Margaret sang her favorite lullaby, the same one she'd sung to her own children. For one brief moment, all the walls had come down. "Officer Garcia," Margaret called softly, "could you make sure Victoria gets a message from me? The kind officer nodded, pulling out her notepad. Margaret thought carefully before speaking. "Tell her I still remember all the words to that lullaby, and I'm still here when she's ready to wake up from this nightmare she's created." The message would probably be ignored, maybe even fuel Victoria's rage. But Margaret had spent 30 years trying to break through those walls. She wasn't about to stop now, even if it meant reaching out from behind bars. The truth exploded like a bomb on a quiet Tuesday morning. Detective Wong burst into Margaret's interview room, clutching a stack of documents still warm from the printer. "We've found it," he announced, spreading papers across the table. The second set of books. Victoria wasn't just gambling, she was helping launder money for the entire Golden Palace operation. Robert Martinez leaned forward, his forensic accountant's eyes scanning the numbers. These transactions, they're massive. Victoria was using the family's real estate holdings as a front. Buy low, sell high, clean millions in dirty casino money through the properties. The evidence was damning. Victoria had created a sophisticated network of shell companies, all connected to Marcus Wong's operations. Each company existed only long, enough to handle a single property transaction before dissolving, leaving a complex trail that had taken months to unravel. "That's why she needed you out of the way," Linda explained to Margaret. "The properties are still in James's name, with you as the executor. She couldn't move forward with the bigger scheme until she had control of everything." But the most shocking revelation came from an unexpected source. Thomas had been going through their father's old study when he discovered a hidden compartment in the desk, a habit James had developed during his years of handling sensitive business deals. Inside was a USB drive containing years of private recordings. James, it seemed, had suspected something was wrong with Victoria long before his death. The recordings documented his growing concerns about her behavior, the unexplained absences, the increasingly desperate requests for money. The final recording, dated just weeks before his cancer diagnosis, revealed the full scope of his knowledge. "I've discovered something terrible." James's voice crackled through the speakers in the interview room. "Victoria's involved with some dangerous people. I've seen her meeting with men I recognize from police warnings about organized crime. My daughter, my little girl, is trapped in something dark, and I don't know how to save her." The recording continued, detailing James's private investigation into Victoria's activities. He'd hired a detective, gathered evidence, but in the end, his illness had prevented him from acting on the information. His final words on the recording struck Margaret like a physical blow. "If anything happens to me, Margaret will know what to do. She's always been the strongest of us all." Detective Martinez connected more dots. The casino's been pushing Victoria to deliver on her promises. She guaranteed them access to prime real estate for money laundering, but she couldn't proceed. While you controlled the estate. That's why they helped her create such elaborate forgeries. They needed you eliminated legally. Michael, who had been analyzing Victoria's computer records, found emails that confirmed the conspiracy. "She's been planning this for over a year," he reported grimly. "The casino's enforcers gave her a deadline. Either deliver the properties or pay back everything she lost, plus their money laundering fees." The scope of Victoria's desperation became clear as they dug deeper. She hadn't just gambled away her own money. She'd taken advances from the casino's loan sharks, promising them legal ownership of the family's most valuable properties in return. When James's will revealed an equal distribution of assets instead of the full control she'd promised them, she'd had to act fast. Sarah discovered Victoria's ultimate plan hidden in a series of encrypted emails. "She was going to sell everything," she explained, her voice shaking. "Not just Dad's properties, but Mom's house, the family business, even the children's trust funds. She'd promised it all to these criminals." The evidence painted a picture of a woman so deep in addiction and crime that she'd lost all perspective. Victoria had convinced herself that destroying Margaret was her only way out, blaming her stepmother for everything that had gone wrong in her life while sinking deeper into criminal conspiracy. But Victoria's carefully constructed plan had fatal flaws. In her rush to frame Margaret, she'd left traces of her real activities. The forged documents, meant to incriminate her stepmother, actually provided the first links in the chain that led investigators to the larger criminal enterprise. She made a crucial mistake, Detective Wong explained, pointing to a series of bank transfers. The accounts she created to frame you used the same signature patterns as the ones she used for money laundering. Once we knew what to look for, the whole scheme unraveled. The final piece fell into place when Marcus Wong himself was arrested in a separate investigation. Facing serious federal charges, he quickly offered to trade information about his real estate money laundering operation. Victoria's name was at the top of his list. Margaret sat quietly as the full truth emerged, her heart heavy with the weight of James's final burden. He had known about Victoria's troubles, but had been unable to save her from herself. Now, understanding the full scope of her stepdaughter's crimes, Margaret realized that her own arrest might have actually saved Victoria from an even worse fate at the hands of her criminal associates. Thomas voiced what everyone was thinking. She wasn't just trying to steal the inheritance. She was desperately trying to cover up years of criminal activity before it all came crashing down. As if on cue, Officer Garcia appeared at the door. "Mrs. Chen, Victoria's just been arrested. They found her at the airport with a fake passport and a ticket to a non-extradition country. She's asking to speak with you." Margaret stood slowly, straightening her prison jumpsuit. After weeks of being the accused, she was finally seeing the full picture of the tragedy Victoria had created. Her stepdaughter hadn't just tried to destroy her, she'd nearly destroyed herself and the entire family legacy in the process. "Tell her I'll see her," Margaret said quietly. "It's time we both faced the truth." The prison's conference room had become a war room. Linda Matthews stood at a whiteboard, covered in flowcharts and timelines, directing their counter-offensive with military precision. "We have 24 hours before the preliminary hearing," she announced to the assembled team. "Everything needs to be perfect." Robert Martinez had spent the night organizing the financial evidence into clear, irrefutable exhibits. Bank statements, property records, and Victoria's second set of books were arranged in chronological order, each document telling its part of the story. "The money trail is clear now," he explained. "We can prove every dollar Victoria tried to pin on Margaret was actually part of her laundering scheme." Detective Wong brought another crucial piece to the puzzle. Marcus Wong's confession gave us access to his encrypted files. We found templates for all the forged documents Victoria used to frame Mrs. Chen. The metadata timestamps prove they were created months before she made the accusations. Michael had discovered something equally damning in Victoria's digital footprint. "She used Dad's old laptop to create the fake emails," he revealed, "but she didn't realize it was syncing to his cloud account. We have records of every document she fabricated, complete with editing history. The evidence was overwhelming." But Margaret's court-appointed defender, Paul Davidson, urged caution. "We need to present this strategically," he warned. "Victoria's legal team will try to muddy the waters. We need to make the truth so clear that no one can ignore it." Sarah had been working with the hospital staff who cared for James during his final months. "I have signed statements from 3 nurses and 2 doctors," she reported. "They all confirm that Margaret was the only one handling Dad's medical and financial decisions. Victoria rarely visited, and when she did, she was more interested in his paperwork than his health." As they strategized, Thomas arrived with a stack of old photo albums. "Found these in Dad's storage unit," he said quietly. "There's something you need to see." He opened one album to reveal a series of photographs documenting Victoria's visits to various casinos over the years. James had been quietly tracking his daughter's addiction, building his own case file, even as he hoped she would turn herself around. "Your father was a meticulous man," Linda observed, examining the photos. "Even when he was trying to protect Victoria, he kept evidence of everything. He must have known someday the truth would need to come out." David burst into the room with, Breaking news from his investigation. The Golden Palace Casino just turned over their security footage, he announced triumphantly. They're cooperating with the FBI now that Marcus Wong's operation is exposed. We have clear video of Victoria meeting with known money launderers in the high-stakes room. Margaret absorbed all this information silently, her mind working through the legal implications. Years of paralegal experience had taught her that evidence alone wasn't enough. Presentation was everything. We need to focus on the timeline, she said finally. Show how Victoria's accusations perfectly coincide with the casino's pressure for her to deliver on her promises. Officer Garcia appeared with an update that changed everything. Victoria's asking to make a deal, she informed them. She's willing to confess to everything, but she has one condition. She wants to tell Margaret the whole truth first, in private. The team exchanged worried glances. It could be another trap, Davidson warned. But Margaret was already standing, straightening, her prison jumpsuit with dignity. No more tricks, she said firmly. Victoria's finally ready to talk, and I'm ready to listen. Sometimes the truth needs a willing audience to finally break free. As the team gathered their evidence for the hearing, Margaret paused at the door. Thank you, she said softly, looking at each person who had worked so hard to uncover the truth. James always said family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when you need them most. She walked toward the visitation room where Victoria waited, carrying 30 years of complicated love and pain with each step. The truth had finally emerged from the shadows, but Margaret knew the hardest conversation still lay ahead, not in the courtroom, but in the quiet space between a mother and the daughter who had tried to destroy her. The visitation room felt smaller than usual as Margaret sat across from Victoria. Her stepdaughter's designer clothes had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit matching Margaret's own. Dark circles under Victoria's eyes testified to sleepless nights, and her manicured hands trembled as she gripped the table's edge. I never meant for it to go this far, Victoria began, her voice barely above a whisper. The gambling. It started small. A few games after difficult divorces, something to take my mind off failed house sales. But then I started winning, and when I lost, they were so eager to let me play on credit. Detective Wong observed silently from the corner as Victoria continued. Marcus Wong found me at my lowest point. I was $500,000 in debt, about to lose my license. He made it sound so easy. Just help move some money through real estate deals, and all my problems would disappear. Margaret listened without interrupting, noting how Victoria's hands kept moving to her throat, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. But it wasn't enough, Victoria continued. The more I helped them launder, the more they owned me. When Dad got sick, I thought I could finally fix everything. By destroying me, Margaret said softly, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. Victoria's composure cracked. You were always so perfect, she burst out. The ideal wife, the perfect mother, even to me and Thomas, no matter how awful we were to you. Dad looked at you like you hung the moon. Do you know what it's like, growing up in the shadow of perfection? Tears started rolling down Victoria's cheeks. When Dad changed his will, making everything equal, I'd promised the casino those properties. They'd already advanced me millions against them. Marcus said if I didn't deliver, they'd come after the whole family. I convinced myself that framing you was the only way to protect everyone. A knock at the door interrupted them. Linda entered with a document in hand. The FBI just found Victoria's original agreement with the Golden Palace, she announced. It's worse than we thought. She signed over rights to all the family properties, including the children's trust funds. Victoria seemed to shrink into herself. I was desperate. They knew exactly how to push me, how to use my resentment against you. Every time I saw you with Dad, every family dinner where you played the perfect hostess, every birthday where you got the credit for gifts I'd helped pick out, it all became fuel for what I did. Margaret reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of Victoria's. I was never perfect, Victoria. I was just trying my best, the same as your mother would have done. Every time you pushed me away, I hoped the next day would be different. I found the lullaby recording, Victoria admitted suddenly. In Dad's study after he died, you singing to me that day at the picnic. He listened to it often, didn't he? Every night during his last week, Margaret confirmed. He never gave up hope that his family would be whole again. Victoria's next words came out in a rush. Marcus has more evidence. Documents I created, recordings of our meetings. I'll give you everything, the properties I signed over, the money laundering routes, the names of everyone involved. Just tell me one thing. All those years, why didn't you ever give up on me? Margaret's answer came from 30 years of love that no amount of hatred could erase. Because you were mine to love, Victoria, not by blood, not by law, but by choice. Every day I chose to love you, even when you made it nearly impossible. The confession continued for hours. Victoria revealed every detail of her criminal activities, every step of her plot against Margaret, every person involved in the scheme. Detective Wong's recorder captured it all, building an airtight case against the casino's operation. When Victoria finally ran out of words, she looked at her stepmother with eyes that, for the first time in decades, held no hatred. I can't undo what I did, she said quietly, but I can make sure you go home today. Detective Martinez entered with release papers for Margaret. Mrs. Chen, you're free to go. All charges have been dropped. She paused, then added, Victoria's cooperation will be noted in her sentencing recommendations. As Margaret stood to leave, Victoria called out one last time. The roses, she said suddenly, in the garden. The yellow ones were always my favorite. You remembered every year, planting more yellow ones. They're still there, Margaret replied. They'll bloom again in spring. She walked out of the prison into the sunlight, where her family waited to take her home. Behind her, Victoria remained, in custody, facing the consequences of her choices. But for the first time in 30 years, the wall between them had finally begun to crack, letting in the first rays of truth and perhaps, someday, forgiveness. The courtroom fell silent as Margaret Chen took the stand. After weeks of being the accused, she now sat as the state's key witness in the case against the Golden Palace Casino's money laundering operation. Her quiet dignity commanded attention. As she faced the gallery where her family sat, united for the first time in months, District Attorney Elena Rodriguez led the questioning, methodically building the timeline of events. Mrs. Chen, please tell the court about your first indication that something was wrong with your husband's business affairs. Margaret's voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. It was during James's final week. I found document drafts in the printer, property transfer agreements I hadn't prepared. The signatures looked like James's, but I knew he hadn't signed anything that day. He was too weak to hold a pen. The evidence unfolded like chapters in a book. Linda Matthews presented the forensic analysis of the forged documents, highlighting the technological fingerprints that tied them to Victoria's devices. Robert Martinez walked the jury through the complex web of financial transactions that had turned legitimate family properties into money laundering fronts. Victoria sat at the defense table, her face pale but composed as her crimes were laid bare. She had already entered a guilty plea as part of her cooperation agreement, but she still had to face the public revelation of her actions. When called to testify, she spoke without attempting to minimize her guilt. I fabricated evidence to frame my stepmother for financial crimes she never committed, Victoria stated clearly. I did this to gain control of family properties I had already illegally promised to Marcus Wong and the Golden Palace Casino as part of their money laundering operation. Detective Wong presented the surveillance footage showing Victoria's meetings with casino operators. Text messages and emails revealed the escalating pressure she had faced to deliver the properties. Each piece of evidence stripped away another layer of the elaborate deception she had created. Thomas's testimony proved particularly powerful. My sister convinced me to support her accusations against Margaret by playing on my childhood grief. Over our mother, he admitted. She manipulated my memories to make me see malice in every kind act Margaret had ever done for our family. The prosecution's case was airtight, but it was Margaret's final statement that moved many in the courtroom to tears. Asked about seeking punitive damages, she looked directly at Victoria. I don't want punishment. I want healing. My stepdaughter needs help, not hatred. She's still the little girl I tucked into bed, the teenager I drove to dance classes, the woman I've never stopped loving, despite everything. Judge Harrison's ruling came swiftly. Margaret's record was officially cleared, with a formal apology from the district attorney's office for her wrongful arrest. Victoria's cooperation had earned her a reduced sentence, with mandatory rehabilitation for her gambling addiction. As the bailiff led Victoria away, she turned to Margaret one last time. I'm sorry, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Not just for what I did, but for all the years I wasted hating the only mother I had left. Margaret watched her stepdaughter leave, remembering another courtroom 30 years ago where she and James had sat, finalizing their marriage and the blending of their families. They had been so full of hope then, believing love would be enough to heal all wounds. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to hear Margaret's statement, but instead of bitterness or triumph, she spoke of redemption. Today isn't about victory or defeat, she told the cameras. It's about truth, and the power of truth to set us all free, even from the prisons we build in our own hearts. The autumn sun cast long shadows as Margaret descended the courthouse steps, surrounded by her children and supporters. Thomas lingered behind, caught between following his sister's departing figure and staying with the family. Margaret solved his dilemma by gently taking his arm. We'll visit her together, she promised, every week until she comes home, because that's what family does. We show up, we forgive, we heal, we try again. The days following the trial brought a whirlwind of activity. FBI agents swarmed the Golden Palace Casino, armed with Victoria's detailed testimony about their money laundering operations. Marcus Wong and his associates faced federal charges that would keep them behind bars for decades. The criminal empire that had ensnared Victoria was crumbling, one indictment at a time. Margaret's first priority was salvaging the family's legitimate business interests. She spent long hours with Robert Martinez, untangling the web of properties Victoria had attempted to sign over to the casino. Each document required careful scrutiny to ensure no trace of the criminal enterprise remained attached to the Cheney. Family name? The properties are safe now, Robert assured her, sliding a thick folder of restored deeds across his desk. Everything's back under proper family control. Victoria's illegal agreements have been invalidated. He paused, then added gently, including the children's trust funds. They were never actually touched. Thomas threw himself into helping restore order to the family business. His background in finance, previously used to support Victoria's schemes, now served to protect their father's legacy. Dad built this company on trust and integrity, he said during a family meeting. It's time we honored that properly. The media circus around the case gradually died down, but not before Margaret's story sparked a national conversation about elder abuse accusations and their misuse in family conflicts. Sarah organized a support group for other families dealing with similar situations, turning their painful experience into a source of help for others. Detective Wong brought unexpected news about Victoria's case. Her full cooperation led us to 3 other money laundering operations, he reported. The DA's office is recommending a significantly reduced sentence, with emphasis on rehabilitation over punishment. Margaret's children had mixed reactions to this development. Michael remained skeptical, years of watching Victoria's manipulation making him wary of any sign of change. But Sarah, with her social worker's perspective, saw hope in Victoria's willingness to accept responsibility. People can change, Mum, she said one evening as they sorted through old family photos. Maybe hitting rock bottom was what Victoria needed to finally face her demons. The most touching moment came when Thomas's daughters asked to visit their Aunt Victoria in jail. The teenagers who had championed Margaret's innocence on social media now wanted to understand their aunt's side of the story. Victoria's tearful reunion with her nieces, witnessed by Margaret through the visiting room window, showed the first real cracks in her hardened exterior. Margaret kept her promise to visit Victoria weekly, often bringing small reminders of home. A photo of the yellow roses blooming in the garden, a copy of the lullaby recording from their early days as a family. Each visit brought difficult conversations, but also small steps toward understanding. During one such visit, Victoria revealed the moment she knew she'd lost control of her scheme. "When I saw your face during the arrest," she admitted, "I recognized something I'd spent years trying to deny. You weren't just Dad's wife or my stepmother. You were the mother who chose me, even when I kept choosing to hurt you." The family business began to thrive again under the combined efforts of all the siblings. Even from jail, Victoria contributed by providing insights into potential vulnerabilities in their financial systems. Her experience with the casino's schemes, though gained through criminal activity, helped them build stronger protections against future threats. Linda Matthews helped draft new legal safeguards for the Chen family's assets, creating a structure that would protect their interests for generations to come. "We're not just fixing the past," she explained. "We're building a fortress around your family's future." As autumn turned to winter, Margaret focused on healing the deeper wounds in her family. She organized weekly family dinners, insisting that they set a place for Victoria and share stories about their meals with her during visits. Slowly, the anger and betrayal began to give way to cautious hope. One cold morning, Margaret received a package from Victoria's prison counselor. Inside was a journal filled with her stepdaughter's handwriting, a detailed account of every kind act Margaret had performed over their 30 years together, each one previously twisted by Victoria's resentment, now acknowledged with painful honesty. The final page held a simple message: "I spent 30 years writing a story of hate. Help me write a different ending." Margaret closed the journal, her heart full of the complex love that had carried her through decades of rejection. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the path to redemption now lay open. The truth had finally set them all free to begin again. The Chen family home slowly returned to its former warmth. Margaret's garden, neglected during her time in jail, bloomed again under her careful attention. The yellow roses Victoria had loved as a child spread their petals toward the sun, their resilience a testament to roots that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. News of the Golden Palace Casino's downfall dominated local headlines. Margaret kept the newspaper clippings, not out of vindication, but as a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. Each article mentioning Victoria's cooperation brought mixed emotions: pride in her stepdaughter's eventual courage, sadness for the years lost to addiction and resentment. Thomas spent weekends helping Margaret restore order to James's study. Each photograph and document, a piece of their shared history, finally viewed through clear eyes. In the bottom drawer of their father's desk, they found an unfinished letter to Victoria, written during his final days. "My daughter, I hope someday you'll understand that love isn't a finite resource. It multiplies with each heart that opens to receive it." The family counseling sessions began in a small office overlooking the city park. Dr. Rachel Cohen guided them through the difficult process of rebuilding trust, one painful conversation at a time. Thomas participated in person, while Victoria joined through video calls from the rehabilitation center, her presence on the screen a reminder of both absence and hope. Margaret watched her family struggle with forgiveness, each member processing their pain differently. Michael's anger slowly softened as Victoria shared her struggles with addiction. Sarah's professional understanding of trauma helped bridge gaps in communication that had existed for decades. Through it all, Thomas worked to reconcile his roles as both brother and son, torn between loyalty and truth. During one particularly moving session, Victoria shared a memory from their early days as a family, a simple moment of Margaret teaching her to bake cookies, patient despite the flour-covered kitchen and burnt results. "I pushed you away," Victoria admitted, "but you never stopped trying to show me love." The autumn leaves were turning golden when Victoria began her rehabilitation program in earnest. Her progress reports showed steady improvement, each small victory celebrated by a family learning to hope again. Margaret kept her promise, visiting faithfully each week, often bringing photos of the garden's transformation as a metaphor for their own growth. Thomas took charge of restructuring the family business, implementing new safeguards against future exploitation. He worked closely with Linda Matthews to create transparency in all their operations, his dedication to protecting their father's legacy growing stronger with each passing day. The shadows of guilt in his eyes gradually faded as he found purpose in restoration rather than dwelling on past mistakes. Most importantly, the family dinners continued, Victoria's empty chair now holding a tablet so she could join them virtually. Her presence a reminder that healing was possible, even from the deepest wounds. 1 year after the trial, the Chen family gathered in Margaret's garden for a quiet celebration. Victoria, now in a transitional program that allowed supervised visits home, sat among her siblings on the patio, her face softer after months of therapy and honest self-reflection. The yellow roses she had loved as a child bloomed around them, their fragrance a sweet reminder of innocence not entirely lost. Margaret watched her family from the kitchen window as she prepared their father's favorite dishes, her heart full at the sight of Thomas's daughters showing Victoria their social media campaign that had now evolved into a support network for families affected by gambling addiction. The healing wasn't perfect, but it was real as the garden that had survived neglect to bloom again. In James's study, now a warm family room where old wounds had finally begun to heal, Margaret found his final gift. A letter, tucked away in his favorite book, meant to be discovered when the time was right. "Love is patient, love is kind. You taught me this, Margaret, and through you, our children will learn it too. Even in the darkest times, love lights the way home." She shared the letter with Victoria during their next garden talk, two women who had traveled so far from imprisonment, one physical, one emotional, to find freedom in forgiveness. The yellow roses bloomed around them, testament to roots that grow stronger through storms.